At the Kansas State Department of Education website, ksde.org, you can find the archives of our meetings. One way to get there is to go to Board over here, and then the Archive Board Media Streaming. I'm going to go to the May 17th meeting and then advance the playhead or the timeline to the pertinent part of the meeting.
Carolyn, if you would take over from here on, and with the commemoration of the anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education, May 17th.
Well, it's an honor for me to introduce our presenter today, Ms. Cheryl Brown Henderson, who is sitting in the back. I'm sure she will come forward. But I've known her, I think, all of her life. But the wonderful thing is that Reverend Oliver Brown and Mrs. Lola Brown were my pastor and our first, now we call them First Ladies at Historic St. Mark's African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, Cheryl is the baby in the family. You'll take that right now, won't you? And but I'm just gonna, and we're running late, and she has so much that she has accomplished. There's just a couple of things that I surely want to read. I'm sure she's going to share this, so maybe some of this I'm not going to share. You're going to do about the history of, yes, okay, that's what I figured. But she is the founding president of the Brown Foundation for Educational Equity, Excellence, and Research, and owner of Brown and Associates Educational Consulting Firm. Now, she graduated with a bachelor's degree in elementary. You can come on forward up to the podium. In the elementary education, a minor in mathematics from Baker University. She has her master's degree in guidance and counseling from Emporia State University and an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Washburn University. Now, I'm just going to say that without Cheryl, there would not be a National Historic Site here in Topeka. She, as I remember Reverend Brown, he was just such a kind, sweet gentleman, but her mother is a little feisty lady, and I think that Cheryl got that determination to make sure that things would be done the right way, and we would have this honor from her mother, that spirit. And I love Mrs. Montgomery, and Miss Montgomery is still busy doing all her work in her church and all. But I do want to share that without Cheryl, there would not be a historic site. She has worked with Congress and the National Park Service to preserve the sites associated with the landmark Brown v. Board's decision. And it was in 1988 that she founded the Brown Foundation. And the foundation has given, I think it says I think the board members have this, but I don't know how many scholarships to young people. And what I'm jealous of, she's been invited to the White House 7 times. So she probably knows just how to get on in there and get to the right rooms and everything. But not just because of that, but because she has been so committed to making sure that we, the country, that everybody understands Brown v. Board. And so with that, I'm going to, oh, wait a minute. She's now a doting grandma of twins, sweet little girl and boy.
Thank you for that. Well, good morning. I want to thank Carolyn Williams Campbell for that introduction. I've known her since she was in junior high school. So since she was trying to embarrass me a little bit, I'll do that to her. You can imagine a junior high school age Carolyn. I've known her for a very long time. And as she said, that my father was their pastor, the late Reverend Oliver L. Brown. Coming before you is a lot like coming home. I was employed by the Kansas State Department of Education there on 10th and Quincy from 1979 to 1994. And it was a position I absolutely loved. It gave me a chance to travel my state. I've been to places like Mankato and Liberal and Dodge, and passed by little places like Protection, Kansas, and Enterprise. And, I've stayed at some hotels that hadn't been stayed in a very long time out by Nicodemus. But I absolutely loved it because I am a Kansas girl through and through. And one of the things I enjoy the most with having the opportunity and the privilege to travel around our country and talk about Brown v. Board is credentialing our state. I believe we are not proud enough of our accomplishments historically. So I take a great deal of pride of telling people that little state that you fly over, that little state that you drive through and don't stop, had it not been for Kansas, a lot of the civil rights gains in our country would not have taken place. Starting with my cousin, who I think was not insane but well-meaning, John Brown. And I say that because early in the morning, if you've seen that mural, I look a lot like John. A little wild and crazy, but well-meaning. But nonetheless, starting there and taking people through Brown v. Board and the election of Nancy Landon Kassebaum and all of the other activities, I was so privileged in working on Brown v. Board National Historic Site to work with Bob Dole. He and I struck up a friendship. I try to see him when I get into D.C. on occasion with Jan Meyer and Dan Glickman and Jim Slattery and all the folks that were in the House and the Senate at that time. And then I had the privilege of working with the next delegation, even our current governor when he was a congressman and then a senator, as well as some of the others. But they were amazing during the process of writing the legislation, lobbying for this bill. Other states were on board because Brown v. Board, as you know, covers a lot of geography. Brown is a consolidation of 5 cases: Delaware, Kansas, Virginia, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C. There is no Brown with Kansas alone. Brown is consolidated and a consolidation of those places. So we take a great deal of pleasure in helping people learn who those et als are. Now, one of the things I tell legal groups, I spoke to the Kansas City Metropolitan Bar back in December for their 130th annual meeting, but I told them one of the things I do not like is et al. E-T period, A-L period. It buries so many people. It obscures their role in history. In Brown v. Board, Oliver L. Brown et al. Versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas et al., hundreds of people that are relegated to 4 little letters. So the reason it was so important to have a National Historic Site, the reason it was so important for us to continue the work that we do in developing curriculum and working with teachers and students and all of that is people that sacrifice the way so many of these folks did, need to be known. They need to have their place in history revered, if you will. Now, we were very lucky, being born and raised and living in Kansas. Now, Kansas has always had its challenges, mind you. And I know that the struggles that you are having right now are certainly not unfamiliar to Kansas, to the state board, to the legislature, to policymakers. When I worked for the Kansas State Board of Ed, we struggled with working with schools on accommodating students with disabilities. And one of my jobs at that time was to go out and conduct OCR reviews, Office of Civil Rights reviews, where it applied to how are you accommodating students with disabilities. Now, I was hired as the state coordinator for vocational guidance and counseling. I worked in the Division of community colleges and vocational education, which doesn't exist anymore, I don't believe. But it was a tremendous learning experience as well. My role was managing the federal dollars that came in under the Carl Perkins Vocational Education Act, where it applied to career guidance and counseling. And then I moved on to gender equity, and that was an eye-opener because we worked on how do we give girls and women access to the skilled trades? How do we give girls and women access to the kind of training that would afford them an opportunity to make a living wage? So from that work, I was able to work with some of the national women's groups. I did chair one of those groups. I was on that board for 11 years and traveled the country. And our crowning achievement was taking 800 women to Capitol Hill And on that particular day, every bathroom on the second floor of the Dirksen was a women's bathroom because we had so many women there. Senator Paul Simon was one of our key supporters, but I'm not here to talk about that, and I will be brief. You are commemorating Brown v. Board of Education today, the 62nd anniversary of that decision. And another thing I think when we think about the commemoration of Brown and how it applies to the discussion you were having earlier, is that Brown v. Board, in the 5 reasons I believe it is so significant, overturned laws on the books in 21 states that either permitted or required segregated public schools. So it became necessary in that instance for Supreme Court, federal, whatever you want to call it, intervention, because rights were being arbitrarily restricted by state and local governments, solely on the basis of race in this instance. Kansas, as you know, dealt with it a little differently, although they were on board with the sentiments of the country, in particular the South. 1879, the Kansas law that allowed cities of 15,000 or larger, like Topeka, Wichita, Kansas City, to have segregated schools, but only at the elementary level. I've never been able to respond to why, other than economics. So when Brown v. Board was organized in Topeka, first of all, Brown was the 12th legal challenge, as some of you may already know, in the state of Kansas with respect to desegregating public schools. First one was in Ottawa, Kansas, Tennant versus Ottawa School Board. So Ottawa, Parsons, Galena, Coffeyville, Wichita, Merriam, 11 cases, 3 other cases in Topeka before Brown v. Board. I say this because another, I think, shining example of Kansas and Kansas leadership was the fact, like no other state in this nation, Kansas was a hotbed of legal activity challenging the notion of it being unconstitutional to deny rights to children and their parents solely on the basis of their complexion. Now, when you get right down to it, a person's complexion has nothing to do with another person's ability to acquire an education. But we have allowed it to be a benchmark for who has access to the best, if you will. And we still struggle with that. Mississippi, I hear today in the USA Today paper, just after how many decades, finally settled a ruling on school deseg. People are still battling over this. So when Brown was decided today at 12:52 p.m., so not quite yet, a lot of things began to change. However, the same kind of pushback that we are seeing around the country now with the recent mandate from this administration began shortly thereafter. We know about Little Rock, but we don't know about Farmville, Virginia, most of us. Farmville, Virginia was one of the cases in Brown, and public officials there closed public schools for 5 years rather than allow African American and white children to attend together. The example I always give, if I'm 8 years old and I'm in 3rd grade, 5 years later, I'm 13. Do I go back to 3rd grade? No. I've been to Farmville on 2 occasions, and there are people, white, black, and otherwise, that are still angry at the government, at local policymakers for the pushback to Brown. They have literacy issues, issues with employment. And when you really get down to it and peel back the layers, the big question is why? Closing schools, cutting off that educational opportunity, rather than comply with something as simple as allowing children who know no difference to go to school together. So there was a lot of pushback. Next came the Southern Manifesto from the United States Congress, saying that it was judicial overreach, that it was an abuse of power, that they were going to use every legal means possible to overturn Brown v. Board, applauding the states that made it clear they were going to resist, like the Arkansas and Virginias of the world. So when we look around the country, people continue to struggle with issues of school desegregation and how we fund the schools, in particular schools that are populated by students of color. It's not a head scratcher, because the pushback was immediate and relentless and has not stopped. even to this day. So a lot of us have adopted the policy, personal policy, and of course in giving lectures around the country, is that, you know, we can't allow our teachers and students to suffer while policymakers duke it out. We need to be educating kids where we find them. Doesn't matter if every kid in your school is African American. They deserve your best. Doesn't matter if every kid in your school is Latino. They deserve your best. Let's not worry about who's sitting next to who right now. That's not your issue as a school teacher. But sadly, in a lot of instances, we have burdened them with some of those challenges that are political and at the policy level. Let me give these out, and then I'll make a few historic statements and then see if there are any questions. So getting off my soapbox, the other person I want to applaud today in your commemoration is McKinley Burnett. McKinley Burnett was the chair of the Topeka NAACP, and much like Carolyn talked about my leadership of creating Brown v. Board National Historic Site, which, by the way, let me digress for a moment. Monroe School, the building that's there now, was built in 1926. In 1926, my mom, who's now 95, turned 95 last Saturday, was a first grader when the building was brand new. And at the time, African American students in those segregated schools, McKinley, Buchanan, Monroe, and Washington, attended school first grade through 8th grade in those buildings. So mom was a student there. When mom grew up, met dad, got married, started having children, both my sisters, Terry and Linda, were students at Monroe. Years later, when they grew up, got married, had children, their children were students at Monroe. And then in 1972, when I graduated from Baker, I became a teacher at Monroe. So not simply were we looking at a way to preserve Brown's story, but we have such an intergenerational relationship with that building, if you will. It has meant so much to our family, and now it means so much to the nation as a repository of the Brown story. But McKinley Burnett came before the Topeka Board of Education for 2 years every meeting. Public comment section, sometimes they would not allow him to speak, but he wanted to convince the school board to simply integrate the elementary schools in Topeka because the law said you had that choice. So absent success over that 2-year period, he decided that it was time to take this to court. And rather than like the early cases I mentioned, they wouldn't just go to state Supreme Court, the old Supreme Court chambers that we know of in the state capitol, but we would go to federal court this time. That was the difference. So Mr. Burnett, Lucinda Todd, Charles Scott, John Scott, of course you know about the Scott Magnet School here in Topeka. Charles Bledsoe recruited parents. There's so many stories out there, and the reason we developed curricular resources for schools across the state, first of all, in the late 80s when we found out that the state legislature was going to mandate the teaching of Kansas history, we knew that Brown would not be taught comprehensively, so we got very busy developing exhibits and DVDs and teacher's guides and all those things to help Kansas students understand Brown v. Board, but also to develop some Kansas pride around that topic. So McKinley Burnett and his team knocked on doors, talked to friends. Charles Scott, who was a personal friend of my father, came to our home and asked my father if he would be willing to participate. Ironically, though, when they came to our home, they had 9 families that had already signed on. And they were all women at that point. My father asked a very pointed question: will there be any more men? And so Charles Scott said to him, I don't know, but we're certainly going to work to recruit some more dads as well. So in the fall of 1950, when they had an assemblage of 13 families who said yes, that they would be part of the NAACP's case. This was not a case brought by my father. It was the NAACP. It was an organizational case. So in the fall, they asked the parents to locate the nearest white school to their home. Because you have to remember, in Kansas, the African-American schools, particularly in Topeka, were class acts. The buildings were all built by the same person. They were lovely buildings. The African-American educators held more advanced degrees than their white counterparts, more master's degrees and postmaster's degrees, simply because there was no other outlet for that degree. So they were well-educated people. So we were not talking about quality, we were not talking about school buildings, we were not talking about school buses. We were simply talking about, I can't go down the way in my integrated neighborhood and go to school because I have to wait to be assigned to a school based on the complexion of my skin. So in the fall, those parents located the closest white school, took their child or children, tried to enroll, came back and told the NAACP what happened. Therein launches Brown v. Board of Education. So February 28, 1951, when it was filed in federal district court, that's when it became known for my father have had a sinus infection all week. Anyway, that's when it became known for my father, Oliver Brown. And when you look at the roster of litigants, which is something I'm fond of sharing with people, particularly women's groups, what you would notice if you could see this in a large version is that all of the parents representing their minor children were women. So there were 12 women and 1 man, Oliver Brown. Alphabetically, Dad was not first. Darlene Brown was first alphabetically. No relation, but first alphabetically. So the thing that we have come to understand that it was pretty much the gender politics of the day that garnered him his place in history. It was not his idea. He was not the first litigant. He was not first alphabetically, but he was the only man. So either it was a legal strategy or the clerk of the court, we don't know to this day how it ended up being named for him. And it is kind of an interesting thing for the ladies because we do know that gender politics has always been with us. And during the 1940s and 50s, men were the head of most things until the women's movement. And then we kind of, started partnering up a little better. But it's just an interesting footnote in history, if you will. But at the Supreme Court level, the cases were consolidated with those that I mentioned to you earlier. We have been very privileged to know many of the people that were involved in the consolidated cases. And one of those trips to the White House, although on those 6 trips, one I had to decline, were under the Clinton and Bush and Obama administrations. But the last one was May 16, 2014, where we were able to take 62 people from the consolidated cases, including Thurgood Marshall's widow and his children, for a reception at the White House to meet this president that so many of the folks that I talked about believed they had a hand in creating the path for him to be there. So one of the things he said when he came in the room to acknowledge everyone was, look where we are now. And we knew what he meant. That was a diverse group of people because there were African American and white Americans that were also involved in Brown. But we knew what he meant, that it had been a long road. Some of the folks in the cases, as I close, lost their lives. The Briggs v. Elliott case, the South Carolina case, Deania Stukes' father was killed for signing the petition to be part of their school dissent case. In the Briggs case, Nathaniel Briggs' father had to leave Clarendon County, South Carolina to find work and move to Florida. You just heard about the Virginia case and what happened there. People lost their land, lost their jobs, lost their livelihoods. So when I say that, those of us in Kansas, because the way Kansas developed as a state that was a free state, we're so privileged compared to our southern counterparts that were involved in Brown v. Board of Education. So when I talk about wanting our students to have Kansas pride and the curriculum that we developed to help them understand the significance not just of the case, but of our state and what it has stood for and what it has represented historically. Now, the human condition changes, and you know that. You're struggling with that now. We're not often prepared when it's on our watch. But we have a responsibility to keep that Kansas tradition of fairness, thinking about the humanity of the people that you're talking about, as Carolyn pointed out, and to make certain that you're on the right side of history, so that when people read about Kansas yet again down the road, they can say, there goes that sunflower state. They're always doing the right thing. But Brown v. Board, again, something we're very proud of. I've been privileged to know some amazing people, to work for an amazing institution. My time at the State Board of Education, State Department of Ed, and have an opportunity to share this story with the rest of the country. Thank you. Questions? Comments?
Mr. Roberts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. I have an interesting relationship with race relations in a general political setting, you might say. I think the Senate Minority Leader still owes me an apology. We'll get to that some other time. If I were to make a presentation similar to some of the things you said and speak on behalf of civil rights, perhaps even a need for some federal involvement, some continued keeping the eye on the ball for civil rights that states in the past didn't do a good job on. And if I were to finish my comments with something along the lines of, because we have to go the extra mile for our children of color, and this is just a hypothetical, would that be interpreted differently than if I made the same comments and the same admonitions, but my last comment was, because we have to go the extra mile for colored children? Have we reached a point where we are that hypersensitive about language?
Well, semantics have always been important because language has been used to subordinate people. It's been used to set people outside of constitutional protections. So language has been the weapon of choice, if you will. And because historically language has been the weapon of choice, it's not a hypersensitivity at all. It's a recognition how the importance of words and how words often create action. I think that, ironically, having been a school teacher, I taught at, where did I teach? I taught at Monroe and Avondale East, and then I was a school counselor at Clinton Heights and Lafayette, which is no longer there, and then I became a state administrator with this agency. And I say all of that because a lot of the early sensitivity training, there have been all these buzzwords, sensitivity training, and then it was, diversity, and then it was training to deal with students at risk, and then it was all of these things. And all of those things, they all meant the same thing. We're talking about students of color and low-income families. There is a reason that we are gentle on word usage. We can be insulting intentionally. We can use buzz phrases and catchwords because people will know what that means. Allowing a group to self-identify and then getting on board with that has been not only the preferred way of referring to groups of people, but it has been the more politically sensitive way. And I think it's troubling when people say that they want to stop all this political correctness, because those of us that have been on the receiving end of some pretty ugly words know what that means, that they want the door open to return to some of those pretty ugly words. So, I subscribe to political correctness because you need to be gentle with how you speak. You accomplish more when you allow people to self-identify, you identify them that same way, and then you go to bat for them, whether it's gender issues, whether it's issues of ethnicity, all of that. So students of color is absolutely an acceptable term. Colored children denotes pre-Brown, when colored was used as a way to write us outside of constitutional protection. So it's a loaded word. It's a loaded term.
Thank you. And a follow-up to that would be, do you envision any way that we could stop labeling children by race in Kansas schools to foster better race relations? Could we stop labeling children by race?
I love that because I read years ago this teacher that had become a teacher, had quite a struggle. She lived in her car. They were very poor, but she was so determined. And once she became a teacher, because she'd been labeled when she was as a low-income kid back then, she said that labels are for cans, not for children. So, yeah, I think we need to stop labeling our children. I know when I worked for the State Board of Ed, we would have these workshops and all of that, and oftentimes I was the only person of color in the room. This is Kansas, after all. And I remind people of that there are not a lot of people of color in the state. But those of us that are here are very proud Kansans and certainly subscribe to the same system of understanding about our state. But I would always remind people when you're talking about statistically how this group and that group, compare apples and apples and oranges and oranges. Don't mix them all in there together. So if you do that and talk about children across the board that are not achieving, that you're trying to do better for, talking about children across the board who are coming from low-income homes that need that additional assistance, children across the board. But it's when we take that group and then start creating subsets, that gets us in trouble. So I agree with you completely that, and Carolyn and others that subscribe to, it is our kids at the end of the day that are important, regardless of their complexion, their condition of birth, their socioeconomic status. The job is to make sure they become productive citizens. The superintendent of education, the state superintendent of ed back before Brown, believed in integrated schools and certainly supported what the NAACP was doing. So, yet again, we've got that Kansas spirit coming through. You're welcome.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Thank you for helping us. I actually taught Kansas history, and I just had a great history lesson.
Okay.
Thank you very much. There's much to be learned.
Good. Happy Brown.
And I like the idea, the myth versus reality part. I'm really anxious to get into that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you. But thank you very much, and thank your family.